Number 14, yakitori, black market grilled chicken skewers. Here is the dish that was technically illegal and universally eaten. The occupation food rationing system prohibited the unlicensed sale of food outside of official channels. The black markets, yami-ichi, literally dark markets, that sprang up in every major Japanese city by late 1945, violated this prohibition completely, openly, and with the tacit tolerance of a population that had no intention of starving to respect a regulation. Yakitori, small pieces of chicken threaded on bamboo skewers and grilled over charcoal, appeared at black market stalls throughout the late 1940s as one of the most accessible hot-cooked foods available outside the rationing system. The chicken was obtained through channels that nobody examined too carefully. The charcoal was similarly sourced. The price was high relative to the post-war wages and irrelevant relative to the alternative of not eating. Workers leaving factory shifts, families navigating the ruined city centers, children sent by their mothers with coins and instructions, all of them converged on the yami-ichi stalls, where the smoke rose and the smell of charcoal and caramelizing soy sauce and chicken fat was the most compelling argument available that the world still contained things worth wanting. The black markets were officially shut down as the rationing system normalized in the early 1950s. The yakitori stalls were not shut down. They simply moved to the alleyways beneath train stations, obtained licenses, and became one of the enduring institutions of Japanese working-class food culture. The legality changed. The smoke, the skewers, and the specific comfort of standing in a narrow alley eating grilled chicken after a long day remained completely intact. Number 13. Curry udon, cheap curry over thick noodles. Japanese curry had arrived before the war via the British Navy's influence on the Imperial Japanese Navy's cooking traditions, traveling a route from India to Britain to Japan that represents one of the stranger migrations of culinary history. The post-war version bore little resemblance to what the naval officers had eaten. American surplus flour made udon noodles cheap and abundant. Curry powder, which survived rationing better than most flavoring agents, provided heat and complexity. Water, root vegetables, and whatever scraps of protein were available completed the pot. The result was a thick, deeply spiced broth over chewy noodles that delivered flavor in quantities wildly disproportionate to its cost. Curry powder transformed plain vegetable broth into something that tasted aggressively seasoned, that tasted, crucially, like a choice had been made, like someone had decided that dinner should taste like something specific, rather than simply like whatever was available. In a food environment defined by monotony, this was not a small thing. By the early 1950s, curry udon had appeared in the first generation of cheap noodle shops rising from the cleared rubble of Japanese cities, served in deep bowls at low wooden counters to workers who ate quickly and completely and returned to work without having spent more than a few yen on the transaction. Working class food, honest food, food that tasted like exactly what it was. Number 12. Korokke, potato and ground meat croquettes. Korokke arrived in Japan from French cuisine via the Meiji-era westernization movement, and the post-war period stripped it to its essential minimum and discovered that the minimum was enough. Mashed potato. Sweet potato was frequently substituted when regular potatoes were scarce, combined with a small amount of ground meat when available, or simply seasoned with salt and soy sauce when it was not, formed into oval patties coated in breadcrumbs made from stale bread scraps and fried in a minimum of oil until the exterior achieved the specific crunch that the Japanese food vocabulary describes as saku-saku, light and crisp and layered. Korokke shops appeared throughout post-war Japan, selling the croquettes freshly fried for a few yen each, and the shops became gathering points in the way that food vendors always become gathering points in communities organized around scarcity. You went for the croquette. You stayed because the warmth and the smell and the company of other people doing the same ordinary human thing of eating something hot in the middle of a cold day was its own form of sustenance. Pre-war korokke recipes called for beef. Post-war korokke used whatever existed. Post-war korokke tasted better, not because the ingredients were superior, but because it was eaten by people who understood exactly what they had been given. Number 11, hayamugi, cold, thin noodles in summer. Summer in post-war Japan presented a specific food problem that the cold months did not. The same fuel scarcity and ingredient limitations that defined winter cooking were present, but they were compounded by the absence of the warming comfort that hot food provided. The psychological sustenance of heat, which in winter transformed a simple bowl into something that felt like care. In summer, that sustenance was absent. What remained was the food itself, stripped of warmth's consolation. Hiyamugi, thin wheat noodles cooked and then cooled in cold water, served with a light tsuyu dipping broth of dashi, soy sauce, and mirin, solved the summer problem elegantly and cheaply. The noodles were made from the American wheat flour that aid programs had made abundant. The dipping broth required a small amount of soy sauce and whatever dashi could be assembled from dried sardines or a piece of kombu. The result was cool, clean, and possessed of a texture. Smooth noodles against the resistance of cold water, the small shock of tsuyu against the palate, that provided genuine sensory pleasure at a moment when sensory pleasure was rare enough to be significant. Elderly Japanese describing post-war summers return to Hiyamugi with a consistency that suggests the dish carried meaning beyond its ingredients. In a season that offered no warmth to leverage, the coolness of the noodles was the comfort. The adaptation was complete. Number 10. Kimpira gobo, braised burdock root with sesame. Burdock root grew in disturbed soil on the edges of bomb sites along riverbanks and roadsides in the strips of earth that bombing had turned over and left unattended. It was foraged by people who knew what it looked like, which in post-war Japan was most people over 40 who had grown up before convenience stores made the knowledge of where food actually came from optional. The long, dark roots were dug from the ground, scrubbed, shaved into thin strips with a peeling motion over the pot that wasted nothing, soaked in water to remove bitterness, and stir-fried in a small amount of oil with soy sauce, mirin, sugar, and sesame seeds into kimpira gobo, a dish of concentrated earthiness and textural resilience that cost whatever effort the foraging required and nothing more. Kimpira gobo provided nutrients that post-war diets were chronically short of. Inulin, the prebiotic fiber in burdock, fed gut bacteria that antibiotic use, nutritional stress, and restricted diets had diminished. Iron, potassium, and manganese appeared in the root in concentrations that made it one of the most nutritionally valuable foraged foods available in post-war Japan's urban environment. The people eating it did not know this. They knew it filled the bowl when the bowl needed filling, and that the sesame seeds, toasted until fragrant, made the kitchen smell briefly like something other than deprivation. That was sufficient. That was enough. Number 9. Dashimaki tamago, rolled egg with dashi. When eggs became more accessible in the early 1950s, they became the primary vehicle through which post-war Japanese home cooking began its slow movement from pure survival towards something that more resembled cuisine. Dashimaki tamago, eggs beaten with dashi, soy sauce, and a small amount of mirin, cooked in a rectangular pan in 3 or 4 layers, each layer rolled over the last while still slightly wet to create a layered, tender roll, required more technique than scrambled eggs and delivered more satisfaction in proportion. The dashi extended the eggs. A 2-egg omelet with dashi incorporated could feed more people than a 2-egg omelet without it. The liquid absorbed into the egg during cooking, adding volume and a savory depth that eggs alone never achieved. For home cooks who were simultaneously managing scarcity and trying to produce meals that maintained the dignity of proper cooking, rather than simply the function of fuel delivery, Dashimaki tamago represented an important middle ground. It required skill. It produced something recognizably beautiful. The golden layered roll sliced to reveal its interior geography. And it did all of this from ingredients that were becoming, at last, affordable. It was the egg transformed from emergency ration into craft, which is the story of post-war Japanese food in miniature. Number 8. Daikon no Happa Gohan, daikon leaf rice. Here is the ingredient that every modern cook throws away without thought. Daikon leaves, the feathery green tops still attached to the radish when purchased whole from a market, contain more beta-carotene, more vitamin C, more calcium, and more iron than the white root they crown. They are also free, included in the purchase of the daikon, available to anyone who buys the vegetable whole and does not discard the greens before the radish reaches the kitchen. In post-war Japan, nothing attached to a purchased food item was discarded. The daikon leaves were blanched briefly in boiling water, squeezed dry, chopped into short lengths, and mixed through freshly cooked rice with a splash of soy sauce and a scattering of sesame seeds. Daikon no hapa gohan, green-flecked rice that delivered nutrients the plain rice beneath it completely lacked. The practice required zero additional cost. It required only the knowledge that the leaves were food, which the post-war generation possessed absolutely, and the generations that followed it have largely lost. Number 7. Ochazuke with salted salmon, tea rice with fish. Ochazuke in its post-war form was chazuke elevated by the addition of a single piece of salted salmon, shiozake, flaked over the cold rice before the hot tea was poured. Salted salmon was preserved, affordable relative to fresh fish, available through the rationing system in small allocations, and possessed of a flavor intensity that meant a small amount went a long way. A single small piece of salted salmon, flaked carefully to distribute it across the surface of the rice, seasoned the entire bowl through the tea that carried its salt and fat outward into every grain. The technique of using salted, intensely flavored ingredients to season a larger volume of bland base ingredients is the master principle of post-war Japanese frugal cooking. A little of something strong could taste like a lot of something mild, if applied correctly. Cooks who had lived through the war understood this with a precision that their children and grandchildren raised in abundance rarely developed. The salted salmon in the ochazuke was not just flavor. It was an argument about how to make things last, expressed in a bowl of tea and rice that tasted, against all reasonable expectation, genuinely good. Number 6. Soba with leftover vegetable broth, buckwheat noodles in found soup. Buckwheat soba noodles existed in the Japanese culinary tradition long before the war, associated with the working-class neighborhoods of old Edo, Tokyo, and the fast, cheap lunch culture of merchants and craftsmen who ate standing up and returned to work within minutes. The post-war period stripped this tradition to its foundation and discovered that the foundation was sufficient. Leftover vegetable cooking water, the liquid in which daikon or burdock or sweet potato had been simmered, seasoned minimally with soy sauce and a scrap of kombu, became the broth for soba in kitchens where dashi stock was too expensive or too ingredient intensive to produce daily. The noodles cooked directly in the vegetable broth, absorbing its faint mineral sweetness, a scattering of green onion, a shake of shichimi pepper if available. The meal was assembled in the time it took the water to boil and the noodles to cook, which was 10 minutes, which was all the time and all the fuel that the situation permitted. Number 5. Misoni, mackerel simmered in miso. Mackerel was the fish of post-war Japan by default rather than by choice. It was abundant in Japanese coastal waters, cheap at market, and possessed of a strong, oily flavor that more delicate palates found challenging and that hungry people found irrelevant. Misoni, mackerel simmered in a sauce of miso, sake leaves, mirin, ginger, and water until the sauce reduced and thickened and coated the fish in a dark, intensely savory glaze, was the technique that transformed mackerel's liability into an asset. The miso and ginger suppressed the fishiness that put people off the mackerel in plainer preparations. The reduction process concentrated the sauce around the fish until the exterior became almost jammy, sticky, and deeply flavored, and possessed of a caramelized richness that bore no relationship to the cost of the ingredients that produced it. Over rice, with a side of pickled daikon, misoni was a meal that tasted as though it had required considerably more money and considerably more effort than it had. For families operating on post-war food budgets while trying to maintain some dignity in the daily experience of eating, this gap between actual cost and apparent generosity was not a small thing. It was the point. Number 4. Tofu to wakame no suimono, clear soup with tofu and seaweed. Here is the dish that required almost nothing and delivered more than its contents, justified through a mechanism that is difficult to explain without sounding like philosophy, but is in fact simply chemistry. Clear soup, suimono, made from dashi of whatever strength the household's dried fish or kombu supply could produce, with a single cube of soft tofu and a small tangle of rehydrated wakame seaweed, was the most minimal complete meal in the post-war Japanese kitchen. The wakame cost almost nothing and lasted indefinitely in its dried form. The tofu was the cheapest protein available. The dashi, if weak, still provided the glutamates that made the broth taste intentional rather than accidental. But the thing that made suemono genuinely extraordinary in the post-war context was temperature and vessel. Served hot in a covered lacquer bowl, and many families had retained their lacquerware even through the bombing, the light, durable bowls surviving where heavier possessions had not. The steam captured beneath the lid, the fragrance released when the lid was lifted, the clarity of the broth, the elegance of the cube of tofu, and the dark seaweed against the pale liquid. Number 3, gyutan nitsuke, braised beef tongue, no one admitted eating. When American military installations in post-war Japan processed beef for occupation troops, they worked with a set of assumptions about which parts of the animal were food and which were not that reflected American cultural preferences of the mid-20th century. Tongues, hearts, livers, and various other organs were classified as waste or animal feed and disposed of through channels that connected inevitably and immediately with the Japanese black market. Japanese cooks who received beef tongue through these channels understood immediately what they had. Japanese culinary tradition had never made the distinction between meat, muscle organ meat that American processing culture enforced. A tongue was a muscle. It was beef. It was the most affordable beef available, which made it the only beef available, which made it worth treating with care. Braised slowly in dashi, miso, and sake over low heat for 2 hours until the collagen dissolved and the meat became yielding and the braising liquid reduced into a sauce of extraordinary depth. Beef tongue was transformed from the discard of an occupying military force into the best meal many post-war families ate in a given week. Number 2, amazake kayu, fermented sweet rice porridge. The preparation method at number 2 is the one that restaurant chefs in modern Tokyo are charging serious money to recreate, and recreating imperfectly, because what they are selling is the technique without the knowledge that made the technique necessary. Amazake, sweet fermented rice made by introducing koji mold to cooked rice and allowing it to ferment at warm temperature for 8 to 12 hours, was produced in post-war kitchens by women who understood fermentation not as a culinary trend, but as a survival tool. The koji enzymes convert the rice starches to simple sugars during fermentation, producing a thick, sweet, lightly alcoholic liquid that requires no additional sweetener and no additional flavor. Thinned with water and warmed, it becomes a porridge of extraordinary gentleness, easy to digest, sweet without refined sugar, possessed of live fermentation cultures that populated gut bacteria depleted by restricted diets and stress. For post-war families with elderly members who could no longer digest the rough, starchy foods that everyone else was eating, or with small children whose digestive systems were overwhelmed by the monotony and difficulty of wartime rations, amazake kayu was the meal prescribed by grandmothers who had learned it from their grandmothers in a chain of transmitted knowledge stretching back through Edo period medicine into the earliest documented Japanese food culture. Number 1, ichiju isai, one soup, one side, and rice. The most important meal in post-war Japan was not a specific dish. It was a structure, one soup, one side, rice. This was ichiju isai, the ancient principle of minimal sufficiency that samurai philosophers had prescribed as moral discipline, and that post-war Japan arrived at through the mathematics of scarcity rather than the philosophy of virtue. The soup was whatever existed. The side was whatever remained after the soup had been made. The rice was the center around which everything else arranged itself, the constant in an equation where every other variable was determined by what the day had allowed. On the best days, the soup was miso with tofu, and the side was a piece of salted mackerel or a small dish of braised burdock, and the rice was white enough to feel like an occasion. On ordinary days, the soup was thin vegetable broth, and the side was pickled daikon, and the rice was extended with barley or sweet potato. On the hardest days, the soup was water with a piece of kombu, and the side was whatever had been found, and the rice was zosui, stretched with so much water that calling it rice porridge was being generous. All 3 versions were the same meal. One soup, one side. Rice, the structure held when the contents could not. The ritual persisted when the ingredients failed. The act of sitting down to a bowl and a plate and a cup of rice, the act of arranging these things before the family and calling it dinner and meaning it, was itself a form of resistance against the entropy that the war had set loose in every direction. Japan rebuilt. The economy recovered. The empty shelves filled. The ration cards were retired. The black markets closed or became restaurants. The sweet potato fields were converted back to other uses. Which of these 25 meals would you want to try? Drop your answer in the comments. And if your family carries any memory of this era, a dish, a smell, a story from a grandmother's kitchen that you only half understood at the time, write it in the comments before it disappears. Some of the most important history in the world is still sitting at somebody's table, waiting to be remembered before the last person who lived it stops being able to tell it.